Every melee combat game has a variety of weapons to choose from, ranging from swords, hammers, polearms, daggers, and so on. But among these weapons, there's one weapon class that's being left behind, such that even the biggest franchises in the world can't seem to agree on how to solve the issue. The many different attempts to balance this weapon class can really best be described as an ongoing identity crisis with no end in sight. The weapon class I'm talking about, which you've already seen from the title of this video, is of course the heavy weapons class. Almost every game with a melee combat system ships with a selection of heavy weapons for you to choose from. These weapons are often hulking instruments of mass destruction with a painfully slow wind-up time which allows the player to do massive damage in about 3 to 5 business days. This is where the problems start to rear their heads for the heavy weapons class. To better understand the problems with this weapon class, let's say you're a developer and you've started work on your brand new melee combat focused RPG. You've finished writing the characters and building the world, and now it's time to add in the weapons available to the player. A weapon can be balanced in 4 different ways: damage, attack speed, range, and mobility. A lot of games only show the damage portion of this stat distribution, while the other stats are more dependent on how the weapon actually plays. Since there are a lot of weapons across the games I've shown so far, let's break it down into 3 categories. Let's start off with the middle of the pack, the medium weapon class. This would include things like the longsword from Monster Hunter, straight swords and sabers from KCD and Elden Ring. These weapons are the quote-unquote jack of all trades, typically shipping with an average stat distribution across the board. These weapons are designed to be a viable tool in any situation against almost any enemy. Next, we have the light weapons. This would include the likes of the dual blades from Monster Hunter and curved swords, daggers and claws from Elden Ring. These weapons differ from the previous category because they are often designed with high mobility and attack speed, which is offset by a lower damage stat at shorter range. And finally, we add our heavy weapons into the game. These would include the likes of the great sword and hammer from Monster Hunter, polearms from KCD, and colossal weapons from Elden Ring. These large LEDs usually ship with a crazy high damage stat, but are offset by low mobility, low attack speed, and medium to low range. Yeah, this is where the problem lies. Unlike the rest of the weapon classes, the heavy weapons class is disproportionately weakened in 3 out of the 4 stats compared to its lighter counterparts. This is done to ensure that the DPS output for each weapon stays roughly the same over the course of a combat encounter. Fair warning that what you're about to see is probably the most devious, disgusting, toe-curlingly horrendous greatsword and dual blade gameplay that you will see. I am not good at these weapons yet and I know it, so speedrunners and Monster Hunter veterans, you have been warned. Light and medium weapon classes are able to output their damage with relatively low risk due to their decent attack speed and high mobility, while heavy weapons are far riskier due to their slow attack speed and limited mobility. On paper, the balance of heavy weapons is achieved through careful stat trade-offs. High damage is offset by slower attack speed and reduced mobility, meaning that every hit carries an inherent risk. This design philosophy rests on the assumption that players have ample opportunity to execute multiple attacks in a controlled setting. However, when this theoretical model is applied to the fast-paced nature of most enemies in modern action RPGs, things start to get problematic for the heavy weapons class. The rapid aggressive behavior of enemies means that the heavy weapons class rarely gets the breathing room required to leverage their high damage potential, exposing a gap between the theory and what actually happens in practice. But high risk, high reward makes sense, right? Is this really an issue with the weapon class? And if so, how serious is it? And how can we possibly fix it? On paper, these 3 weapon classes are balanced, assuming that they are able to attack continuously. But as you know, many melee combat RPGs don't give you that luxury. A majority of the enemies you face throughout these games are fast and aggressive, leaving you with only small windows of opportunity to attack and retaliate before you prepare to dodge another onslaught of their attacks. This is most evident in Elden Ring, where combat can be fundamentally broken down into 2 phases. For example, in the Millennia fight, you are constantly on the defense, only getting a small attack window before going back on the defense. This is the dance of combat that you experience with 99% of enemies in these games, and this is where the heavy weapon class really struggles. At a glance, all of this makes heavy weapons seem sluggish, unresponsive, and overall unfun to play. But if that is truly the case, why do so many games ship with such a variety of heavy weapons to choose from? And more importantly, what have developers done to balance this weapon type and make it fun to play? Let's start with what seems like the easiest fix, tweaking the 4 values that we talked about earlier in the video. Let's begin with damage. This could be my hottest take of the video, but I feel that the damage that heavy weapons do is fine as is, and tweaking it would detract from the weapon class's identity. Increase it, and heavy weapons will become too powerful, allowing players to one-shot most enemies. Or decrease its damage and make the weapon class go from suboptimal to underpowered. Let's just leave the value for damage as is. What about increasing the range of heavy weapons? This would help by reducing the margin of error for attacks, especially against nimble enemies like Monster Hunter's Odogaron and Elden Ring's Revenants. In fact, these games do ship with heavy weapons with long range, like the Falling Star Beastjaw, Golem Halberd and Giza's Pizza Cutter. In Monster Hunter, it's a little bit more complex. While the Greatsword is undoubtedly the heavy weapon with the longest attack range, morphing weapons like the Switch Axe and Charge Blade also have access to powerful attacks with enhanced range, though I wouldn't explicitly call them heavy weapons. Veterans of the series would know what I mean, but for the sake of not getting distracted, let's get back to hybrid weapons later on. All in all, I believe this is the first viable solution for balancing the heavy weapon class, and I am glad that games have implemented them in a balanced manner, maintaining the weapon's high risk, high reward playstyle while also making it just slightly easier to land attacks on nimble enemies. Next, we have attack speed. Contrary to increasing the range of heavy weapons, I believe that increasing the attack speed of this weapon class would make it completely and utterly broken. Imagine this, you are duking it out with a boss who has a 2-second attack window. For simplicity's sake, let's compare the 3 weapon classes based on this 2-second attack window, and all of them are able to make full use of the 2 seconds before needing to escape. The light weapon user would easily get off 8 hits, dealing 25 damage each before comfortably disengaging from the enemy due to the class's high mobility. The medium weapon user would get off, say, 4 hits, dealing 50 damage each, before having a small window to leave due to the class's average mobility. The heavy weapon user will only get off 2 hits, dealing about 100 damage each, before having a tiny window to escape because of its low mobility. In theory, this is how it should work. In 2 seconds, every single class managed to pull off 200 damage. But if you increase the attack speed of the heavy weapon such that it's able to squeeze in even just one more attack, you will be doing way more damage than all the other weapon classes. And when you expand this window of vulnerability, the disparity increases more and more, fundamentally breaking the balance of the game. There is a reason why heavy weapons are always associated with being slow and powerful, because if they were given even marginally faster attacks, the light and medium weapons would be hilariously outclassed from a DPS standpoint. I don't think changing the attack speed is the way to go with this one. And finally, we have mobility. I think this could add a really cool dimension to the heavy weapon class, where experienced players are able to utilize their higher mobility and improve positioning to ensure maximum damage output, in spite of the low attack speed and range. The best example of this in practice, in my opinion, is Monster Hunter's Hammer. It's a massive weapon, but unlike its brother the Greatsword, it's not exactly a weapon with good reach. But to make up for this, Capcom has designed the hammer such that it's far more mobile than its counterparts in the same weapon class. Many of its moves come with dashes and grapples, allowing an experienced user to stick to even mobile enemies, dodge attacks and output damage despite the weapon's slow attack speed and shorter range. In my eyes, this is a viable solution to make the heavy weapons feel more responsive, while keeping it balanced such that you are still limited by your low reach. This makes hunting taller monsters like Anjanath and Shuwu a challenge, as their weak spots are usually out of your weapon's range for most of the fight. Alright, so we've covered the most straightforward ways developers have tried to balance the weapon class, with a few winners, particularly in giving the weapon more range or more mobility. But we can go a little deeper, because these games also employ a number of tricks to make the heavy weapons class feel even more fun and responsive. Speaking of responsiveness, there are a few games that come close to the tactile feeling of the FromSoft games, and to me this has got a lot to do with the mechanics known as... If you've played any of the FromSoft games, you will know about poise and stance. If you haven't played these games at all, let me break it down for you. Think of stance as an invisible HP bar that all enemies have. Every time an attack hits an enemy, it deals a certain amount of stance damage and reduces their remaining stance bar. Once you do enough stance damage and reduce their stance bars to 0, enemies become stance broken and are now vulnerable to a critical hit. Think of it like being knocked out in a boxing match. Repeatedly pummeling an enemy eventually tires them out, giving you a window to land a devastating blow when their guard is down. At this point, you might be thinking, if stance damage is applied by all forms of damage, why choose heavy weapons? Shouldn't we be going for faster weapons to do more poise damage? And you would be right, if all weapons did the same amount of stance damage. In Elden Ring, heavier weapons like the Giant's Crusher do far more damage than lighter, faster weapons. I mean, it's not hard to understand, just look at it, it's a giant rock on a stick. No wonder it does tons of stance damage compared to this or that. On paper, we've added a fifth value to our balance sheet, stance damage. And generally speaking, this would make the stat distributions of our 3 weapon classes look something like this. Now, our heavy weapon class has a clear advantage over the other weapon classes, having an easier time inflicting crowd control effects like stance breaking. What this does in practice is that it provides heavy weapon users with more time to deal damage by interrupting enemies via stance breaking, and helping them to keep up with the DPS output of lighter weapon classes. If you ask me, this is another fantastic solution to sweeten the risk to reward ratio of heavy weapons, giving them an additional combat utility via crowd control, while also retaining the inherent risk of wielding a generally slower weapon. I personally love this mechanic because it feels so satisfying to pull off and adds another layer to the dance of combat we talked about earlier. Speaking of which, Monster Hunter Wilds also spruces up the heavy weapon classes with built-in counter attacks, known as These are special attacks that you can perform just as a monster's attack is about to connect, allowing you to parry the attack. This often knocks the monster back as they reel from the riposte, and your character follows up with a flashy combo of their own. These offset attacks are unique to the heavier weapon classes like hammers, greatswords, hunting horns, and the morphing weapons as well. Beyond being fairly challenging to learn and use in combat, these defensive options are extremely valuable for these weapons, which tend to be less nimble than lighter weapons like the sword and shield and dual blades. I love this mechanic so much because it provides heavy weapon users with options to deal with their lack of mobility with alternative defensive options. While lighter weapons are able to dodge out of the way of incoming attacks, you are able to stand your ground, provided you've mastered the offset attack timings. Succeed and you not only parry the monster's attacks, but you are also rewarded with a unique combo. Or fail and eat a face full of damage. This mechanic rewards skill and mastery and stays true to the high risk, high reward playstyle of the heavy weapons class. A truly perfect way to make this weapon class feel more enjoyable to learn and master. And also, it's satisfying as hell to pull off, so that's a major plus. Have you ever opened a can? No, not that kind of can, this kind of can. Yes, we are finally taking a detour out of Fantasyland and coming back to war-torn medieval Bohemia with the Big H. While swords are cool, they are not exactly great at dealing with enemies in full plate armor. You can see your sword bouncing off the enemy's helmet when it connects, which not only ruins your weapon's durability but also doesn't do much damage. Sure, swords might naturally have access to the all-powerful Master Strike, but the point still stands that they are not the best tool for dealing with an armored enemy. For that, you need one of these bad boys. Polearms and warhammers are far slower than regular swords due to their weight, and it shows in combat where these weapons have limited options of attack, only having 3 while swords have 4. But they are compensated for this weakness by having some of the best blunt damage in the game, which make them the best tools for can opening or rather flattening. Blunt damage in KCD2 always goes through armor, as blunt damage crushes both plate and man underneath. This is fairly realistic as well, where you'd rather have a large hefty weapon in hand like a poleaxe or warhammer to deal with an armored foe compared to a sword.
The warhammer was developed specifically to defeat plate armor.
This mixes realism and gameplay together to give heavy weapons a specific role in combat, making them an invaluable tool in Henry's arsenal for dealing with fully armored foes, while also retaining its weakness of being a slower weapon which struggles against enemies wearing lighter armor, which allows them to dodge and parry the attacks because of their increased agility. On the topic of armor, we have yet to touch on hyper armor, which is more or less a loose term used to describe a window during certain attacks where players cannot be interrupted. Before I move on, I want to highlight that what I'm about to say is purely targeted at Elden Ring's PvE experience and does not apply to PvP. Elden Ring has a number of special attacks or Ashes of War which have built-in hyper armor. Most notably, these are Waves of Darkness, Upward Cut, Lion's Claw, and Giant Hunt. You will notice that these hyper armor windows are granted to lengthy, high commitment attacks which can be performed by large weapons to ensure that they feel satisfying to use. Because if you ask me, nothing feels more annoying than queuing up a powerful attack only to get it interrupted halfway. If I had to guess, the intention here is to reduce the risk of using these attacks, ensuring that they always go through. The trade-off here is that while your attacks are immune to interruption, you can still take damage during the animation. This is a unique system and sort of serves as a hybrid solution where heavy weapons can still retain their slow nature and risk of taking damage in exchange for greater consistency with their attacks. I believe that this is a pretty good mechanic on its own, but can potentially cause issues when it deals loads of stance damage as well. A great example of this is Lion's Claw. With a strength build, this attack paired with a massive weapon is able to stance break bosses in just 2 to 3 hits. This is where things go off the rails, because now you are able to essentially stun lock many bosses to death just by using a heavy weapon paired with the Lion's Claw Ash of War, then spamming this same attack over and over. And I personally believe that this combination makes heavy weapons a little bit overpowered, as it completely negates all of its weaknesses. For example, Lion's Claw helps heavy weapons to close the gap, improving attack range and completely ignores the issue of attack speed and mobility because you are able to keep the boss permanently stance broken, and leaving enemies basically unable to fight back. If I were to suggest a fix for this, I would take a page out of Monster Hunter's book, where each stance break makes enemies more resistant, meaning that each stance break requires more stance damage than the last. This, in theory, balances combat by keeping these special attacks comfortable to use, while also ensuring that enemies are able to retaliate instead of being stunned throughout an encounter. But I am no game developer, so please take my opinion with a grain of salt. How about morphing weapons? Monster Hunter Switch Axe and Charge Blade are great examples of this archetype. Both of these weapons start out in their lighter, nimbler modes and are able to switch into slower, more powerful modes during combat. The tricky part here is that they don't neatly fit into our established light, medium or heavy categories. They are essentially hybrids that lie somewhere on the line between medium and heavy depending on the mode that you are in. And while that ability to shift forms is a cool advantage, it doesn't truly solve the inherent issues of the heavy weapons class. Instead, it just lets you toggle between different playstyles. What I'm trying to say is this. Morphing weapons offer versatility, but they don't solve the core balancing issues associated with heavy weapons. Instead, they sidestep them by letting you choose which set of trade-offs you want to play with. This means that often you will be saving the heavy mode for those moments where you have a long window to unload all of your damage without fear of interruption. Don't get me wrong, these weapons are fun as hell. And if you are able to master when to switch modes, you are capable of doing some of the highest damage in the game. And with the added flexibility of changing modes on the fly, these weapons have so much depth to them and are hands down some of the most engaging weapons to use and learn in the Monster Hunter franchise. So let's wrap up here. We've run through quite a number of techniques developers have used to make the heavy weapons class enjoyable and responsive. Some definitely work better than others, and that's completely fine. It's no easy task to balance a whole weapon class around one fix, and I'm excited to see how other games innovate on this weapon class in the future. In the end, even with all the twists and turns in how heavy weapons are being balanced, I've always found them to be the most satisfying to use regardless of the games which I play. I was introduced to Monster Hunter games in 2018 with my first big title being Monster Hunter World. I tried every weapon and nothing quite spoke to me like the hammer and greatsword. I can't quite explain why I fell in love with these heavy weapons. There's something that's just so addictive about overcoming the challenges of a weapon class, learning its strengths, weaknesses, and knowing how to draw out the maximum potential of the weapon. For me, this was made clear after hours of watching guides and practice. And eventually, I was even able to foresee how monsters would react and plan my attacks in advance. So if you'd like, give the bigger weapons a try sometime. Who knows, you might even like the slower, more strategic pace of these weapons. So while modern action games might seem geared towards quick, nimble weapons with their enemies, both developers and players have shown that there's plenty of room for these behemoths to shine. Whether it's through inventive mechanics, specialized damage types, or just some seriously creative movesets, heavy weapons continue to carve or flatten out their own niche. There's no perfect fix for all of their issues, but as long as they remain fun and challenging, that's all that really matters.